Welcome. My name is Ammi Small, and I'm here today to talk to you about resiliency. We will talk a little bit about the overall term and the concept of what resiliency means in the concept of today's changing world. Then we'll also go through some of the specific findings that we've uncovered through a comprehensive global survey that was just completed a few months back. Before we get into some of these specifics around the study and around the term resiliency itself, I did want to make a brief introduction. As I said, my name is Ammi Small, and I am a principal with Control Risk based in New York City. I've been with Control Risk for about 5 years, and I've been in the broader resiliency and security space for about 20 years. As you can see, we are a global consulting firm specializing in high-risk advisory services. My team covers the Americas and focuses on operational risk with a specific emphasis on crisis management, business continuity, and enterprise risk. Before we get into the concept and some of the details around our resiliency study, I wanted to talk to you today a little bit about what do we mean when we think of resiliency. I often joke that if you ask 5 resiliency professionals for their definition of the word, you'll get 12 different responses. And it's certainly something that has changed a lot over the years. When I think about resiliency, I think about some of the challenges that organizations face today as they are tasked with preparing, responding, and recovering from ever more increasing crisis and incidents that are occurring all around the world. And these are crisis level events that can impact the entire organization or specific critical business functions. And as resiliency and security professionals, when you're asked to prepare, respond, or recover, you're often being asked in this day and age to do so with less resources. We have found both internally through our own research as well as collaborating with clients all around the world that success in this resiliency space can be found when leaders are willing to look inward and build consensus with their peers, and when they are willing to unify the historically separate disciplines that fall under security and resiliency. We think it's also important to set the stage when you think about what does resiliency look like for your organization and for your senior stakeholders when you're talking about the reason and the justification for these types of programs. Why should they be making the investment, right? Whether it's our experience through the pandemic or geopolitical risk, cybersecurity concerns, or natural disasters, we're seeing not just an increase in these types of events, but really a connectivity in the way that they connect across regions, across businesses, across sectors. And as I said in the previous slide, what you're being asked to do is prepare for, respond, or recover to these types of events with less resources. The demands are higher and the resources are less. But we like to provide this imagery here, not to scare stakeholders, not to scare business leaders, but rather to emphasize the importance of these programs, right? You're not just managing risk in a vacuum, but rather the programs that you're putting forward, the initiatives that you're building engagement for are directly connected to events that impact the organization every day. When we think about resiliency, think about the concept, and I've touched on the idea of being asked to prepare, respond, or recover to ever-increasing events with less resources. I'm often asked, how do we do that? What does that look like for us, right? Conceptually, I get the idea, right? We're being asked to do more or given less funding, less resources. What does that mean? So for us to take that concept, move it away from kind of a hypothetical into something much more practical, we like to focus on this balanced approach. It's the idea of building a more unified center as it relates to your resiliency and security programs, but also taking steps to greater empower the business outside of your program. And what does this really mean, right? When we think about a unified center, whether it's crisis management, security operations, or any one of a number of different disciplines, historically, they've operated as in separate silos. They were managed collectively at the top, but they had separate mandates, separate funding, and that's how they were developed, and that's how they were matured. In today's day and age, when you talk about a unified center, it's really important to have an integrated approach that looks both at resources and expertise across disciplines. Whether it's an exercise or a plan or a risk assessment, having people on the team that can do those across disciplines is critically important, again, to being able to do more with less. It's also not just about building the best plan or the best template, but driving engagement through training and awareness. Whether it's through new technology or in-person sessions, bringing the business into your program, spending the time to explain the value and explain the expectations and explain the purpose of what you're trying to do, we find goes a very long way to building that engagement and really ensuring that the center has the buy-in that it needs to be successful. Outside of training and awareness, the idea of robust governance, whether it's through a policy or a procedure or a guidance document, can really go a long way to defining the very specific expectations for the program as it relates to other parts of the business. And finally, and perhaps even most importantly, we find that organizations are getting creative in terms of how they use technology to conduct proactive horizon scanning. This is kind of looking around the corner at what might be coming. And then when an event occurs, when an incident or crisis occurs, leveraging those same platforms to help build situational awareness to more effectively manage through an incident or crisis. So that's the idea of a more unified center. On the other side, it's not just about what your program can design, develop, and implement, but also how you can empower the business to be the owners of the risk, to be the owners of these programs, right? So if your program builds these tools and templates, designs the training, the business then takes all of that and they conduct the assessments, they build their plans, they exercise their plans, etc. Through governance, the business is able to more easily understand what the expectation is of them. Additionally, from a funding perspective, when you think about the idea of doing more with less, when the business is empowered, they can also be asked to fund certain elements of your program, right? So if the center is giving them the tools and the templates for success, the business can then look creatively for ways to fund their own resources, either internally or externally, who can help them satisfy those requirements. And finally, and this is something we've been discussing for years, but it's become much more front and center this day and age, allowing for radical transparency via real-time reporting, right? So it's not just about setting expectations in a government's document, but actually establishing these programs as living, breathing initiatives that are constantly changing based on the risk profile that your company, your organization has, and then using live dashboards to track progress against those requirements. So this first few slides were kind of designed to set the stage. When we talk about resiliency, we think about resiliency, we think about the challenges you face and kind of a practical solution for moving forward. What we want to do now is spend some time going through the results of a survey that Control Risk conducted over the past year. What we did as part of our report is we went out to over 600 respondents around the world, and we asked them a series of questions related to the term resiliency. We received responses back from 32 countries around the world. And as a key data point, over 30% of those who responded were the board of directors or the C-suite. We also received responses across 31 sectors, including manufacturing, financial services, public sector, and healthcare. The remainder of this presentation is designed to walk through some of the key findings at a very high level. But I would urge you, if you're interested to learn more, you'd like to understand where some of this information kind of evolved from and how it was structured, we'll have our contact information at the end. You can certainly reach out to us for the more in-depth, full comprehensive study. We'd also be available to chat through some of these findings as they relate to your specific organization or sector. We started off at the beginning of this presentation talking about the word resiliency. What we found quite interesting, when we last conducted our survey in 2020, 70% of our respondents were using the term resilience to talk about how they think about the way they manage risk. Now, in our most recent study in 2023, that number jumped to 97%. So almost every individual who responded to our survey is now using the word resilience. Further, from a kind of benchmarking perspective, 30% of those are now using the ISO definition of resilience. So what we're seeing is a tremendous increase in the terminology, also a greater alignment with a global recognized standard. I think this is important because, as I said, as I joked at the beginning, if you ask people to define resiliency, they will give you many different definitions. But now what you're seeing is a recognition that across the board, across sectors, that this is a commonly accepted term, A, and then B, they're aligning against a globally recognized standard. And I fully expect that 30% will jump significantly when we conduct our next survey. One of the key points when we thought about risks and resiliency, we wanted to ask those in the survey, how far ahead do they think? How far ahead are they looking, right? I talked about the idea of kind of peeking around the corner and horizon scanning. But really, what does that mean, right, from a timing perspective? And what you see here is kind of a comparison between 2020, again, the last time we did this survey, and 2023, this year. And what we really find interesting is that while from a percentage standpoint, we didn't see much change with those who look about a month out, but we do see significant change where you really start to see a lot of changes when you start moving to 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, or even 2 years. So what we're seeing is a much greater focus on both the kind of things that could occur in the next 6 to 12 months, but also recognition, even if you look all the way at the bottom there, the companies are also starting to look much farther out, 5 years plus. And what this tells us is that there's kind of a balanced approach here. Companies are thinking about the risk to their organization in the next 12 months, but they're also trying to get a better handle on what could impact them much farther down the road. Now, if you look at that one statistic that really did not change beyond the 1 month, you see the 2 years, right? That's interesting. That's kind of been the standard, that 2-year, 24-month time frame. At the same time, the 5 years plus, we found that to be incredibly interesting because significant. I mean, a 4% increase, relatively significant for us, are looking 5+ years ahead. And this impacts not just how you think about your organization today, but the funding requirements and your overall view on risk. Means that these risk and security organizations, resiliency and security organizations, are getting a bit more strategic, right, with their long-term view and how they manage risk. This is relevant when you think about that balanced model that I presented earlier around the unified center and empowering the business. When you're going to have those conversations with business leaders, you're not just asking them what they think will happen in the next quarter, rather asking them to be a bit more forward-looking. This is interesting because in 2020, really at the peak of the pandemic, there was this question around what do you consider to be the most disruptive external threats to your organization over the next 5 to 10 years? 55% of those who responded in 2020 felt that there were cyber concerns. And in 2023, well, that number is still very high at 39%. We've seen a dramatic increase in macroeconomic uncertainty. And when we peeled this back and we looked a bit deeper, what we actually found was that geopolitical concerns, economic uncertainty around the world related to those geopolitical concerns is front of mind to business leaders. And so this number really jumped out to us because as you all know, we spent many years focused on the pandemic and the change that that's had to organizations and how we work. But now we're really seeing an increase around macroeconomic uncertainty. And then connected to that, you also see the changing, supply chain disruption. To us, this is all connected. We're seeing a much bigger focus now around how macroeconomic concerns can also impact our supply chain. And this is really important for resiliency and security leaders because they play a critical role in not just protecting the internal supply chain, but making sure that key vendors and all elements across your supply chain are protected. We've started to look perhaps on the other side of the pandemic on internal threats. We classify as kind of insider risk. We're thinking about that over the next 5 to 10 years. As you would expect in 2020, there has been radical change to business culture, models, and solutions, right? The way that people worked changed radically overnight. It was not surprising to us that this was kind of front of mind. Also, the idea of being able to effectively adopt and manage through a changing environment was another key concern. In 2023, what we see is technology and innovation, right? So changing technology. So if 2020 was this idea of kind of how we change across the board, 2023 is focused on now we are leveraging technology in new and unique ways every single day. What does that mean for our organization? Whether that's concerns around IP or access management, or generally how technology is being used internally within an organization, we're seeing a much stronger focus on this as a threat. We're also seeing kind of from a cultural perspective, we're seeing a lack of relevant skills and talent. This could be interpreted a lot of different ways, but really what we're seeing is that the younger workforce, if you will, is trying to catch up because through the pandemic, they simply didn't have the same access to training and development that was historically available, and now we're seeing a gap. This is interesting. There's a lot more information behind this, But we found that was a key concern. It's also important when you think about functional perspectives, right? Talking about what is most disruptive internally over the next 5 to 10 years. We got different views based on different people who responded. So kind of starting from the right there, if you look at corporate security, people who responded from a corporate security function, they actually found that cybersecurity was their top concern, followed by economic change, political and security instability, and finally supply chain. With the executive team, with the C-suite, we see economic changes as being a top concern, with fully half of those who responded, followed by cyber threats. Then going over to the board, you see kind of an even split between changing market dynamics, economic changes, and climate crisis. This is interesting because as an executive in the resiliency and security space, it's important to recognize that your audience, your buyer, your key stakeholder may come to the table with a different view depending on where they sit in the organization. And so as we often work with C-suite or we work with boards and we try to communicate the value of these programs, or we try to emphasize the importance of making the investment in building capabilities across the organization, we find that it's important to recognize the different perspectives that they bring to the table and to ensure in turn that you're able to emphasize or focus on those points based on your audience. This is an interesting visual here around how mature you are as a resilience organization. Right. Just in terms of the visuals, when it comes to capturing risks and opportunities globally, 58% of our respondents felt that they were optimized. They did this very well. Whereas 33% felt that they were just simply managing it, and 9% were immature. When it comes to identifying and preparing for the next Black Swan event, whatever that may be, we saw similar numbers, as well as when it comes to withstanding the next event. So there's the idea of recognizing that it's coming, preparing for it, and then being able to effectively respond, manage, respond, and recover through that event. Now, again, there's a lot of data behind how this maturity was assessed, but we found it interesting that companies basically responded similarly to these three different questions around maturity. We also asked the people in the survey what impacts would be most concern to you and your business. For this specific question, they were able to choose their top three, but they did not rank them. Right? So what you see here is a collection of how people felt, where people felt the impacts were to their business. Just kind of going left to right. And I think this is consistent with what we saw earlier. 43% were worried about technological disruption and malfunction. 34% were worried about loss of customers and clients for any number of reasons. An equal number were concerned about supply chain disruption. 31% were concerned about the workforce. This relates to culture, morale, turnover, etc. 30% were concerned around reputational damage. 26% focused on reduced revenue and what that means for the organization. This is an interesting one. 24% more worried about the staff, your employees losing confidence in the organization's ability to manage through an event. 24% were worried about loss of new business opportunities. 22% were concerned around legal and regulatory issues. 21% were concerned around public trust, loss of public trust, 11% spoke to leadership transition, change at the top. And finally, 1% worried about others, right? The other category. So if you kind of separate the story here, what you're seeing is a very large number of people focused around technology, and then a lot of the other risks kind of falling in the middle, impacts falling in the middle. You can use this information in a number of different ways. When we have conversations with our clients, when we're advising our clients, and they ask us the question, what is keeping our peers up at night? We can start with this piece of data. We recognize that every company, every organization is different, but at least this gives you a benchmark, a framework for thinking about the top impacts to your organization. Another question we asked those in the survey, in the study, was over the last few years, what business function has been most impacted? And of course, you can see the outlier here around cyber and IT. As we went into the pandemic and we saw that radical change that I just spoke about, every aspect of our work changed. There was really such a focus on cyber and IT. And many businesses around the world did quite well. Some even excelled during the pandemic. And a reason they were able to do so was through cyber and IT. So this doesn't surprise us at all. It also speaks to the impacts of some of the other trends that we saw in our previous questions, our previous analysis. And so it's really important to recognize that there isn't a change that is started a few years back, but is going to continue to grow and expand. We don't see that number decreasing. We actually see it increasing. We see it increasing also as there's stronger alignment with other parts of resiliency and security. We asked our respondents, we've been talking about a lot about what keeps you up at night, what your top risks are, what parts of your business have been impacted. But if you were offered the opportunity to make an investment, right? If you were offered the opportunity to say, where would you like to grow? Where would you like to expand? What would that look like? And so what's interesting here is 48%, both in 2020 and 2023, stated that they would like for there to be greater knowledge of the of resiliency and security programs around the world. What do we do? How do we do it? What's expected? And this really speaks to that concept that I introduced at the beginning of the presentation around empowering the business. So the idea here is that with greater knowledge, greater insight, greater engagement, you can really grow and mature your organization. And this held true 2020, and it holds true today. If you look on the right side, you see this new number, 61%, highlighted the need for better intelligence and tools. This connects back to the point I made around being able to see around the corner and engage in more robust horizon scanning, understanding threats that are emerging before they have the opportunity to impact your organization. This can be both through kind of traditional human intelligence and using internal and external analysts, but also leveraging some of the new tools and technology that are out there today, some of which use AI to process through billions of pieces of data every single day to assess risk to your organization. So being able to have access to those tools is something that a lot of our responders are saying is something that they would like to have. There's also this idea of stronger internal communications. So if 35% of people thought that that was important in 2020, we now see a 14% increase in 2023. This to me speaks to, it is connected to the idea of employee knowledge. But more broadly, it's about, are we communicating effectively with our key stakeholders? Is there a sense that if we're able to fine-tune our internal communication strategy before, during, and after a major disruptive event, we can get through the event better? At Control Risk, we do a lot of training and we do a lot of exercises. And I can tell you that the number one thing that constantly pops up as an identified concern is the idea that we need to get better at how we communicate internally. Companies often assume that they can leverage the same day-to-day communication strategies that they use as part of their normal communications during a crisis or a major disruptive event. And what we find is when those events occur for many, many different reasons, those tools and frameworks and ways of operating fall apart. So internal communications, so critically important. And we're actually glad to see that that number has gone up. What's interesting in 2020 is you see dedicated personnel. This didn't make the cut for 2023. It's still there as a concern, but it's not the top three. And we've done a lot of analysis around this data point, and quite frankly, we're still looking into it. But we did find that perhaps it has to do with the fact that the reality is today that companies are seeing a decrease in staff available to them, at least in that center under that program. So recognizing that security, risk, and resiliency professionals are trying to get more creative and looking for other sources of investment to make up for that shortfall. On this slide, what we're looking at here is we asked our responders, where are you investing to increase capacity and capability? This was not a top three. They had the option to pick as many as they'd like. If we kind of focus on some of the highest numbers here, what we see is cybersecurity, tools and technology more broadly, business continuity, risk monitoring, crisis management planning, and risk assessments that support them. To us, these findings are consistent with the other areas of focus, right? The idea that cybersecurity needs to be greater concern. We need the tools and technology to be able to do our work better. There's a stronger focus on ensuring that if there is a major business interruption, we understand what's most critical to our organization, what needs to come back first and why, and what the dependencies look like under a robust business continuity program. Investing in risk monitoring and horizon scanning means that we can, again, peek around the corner. We also understand what our risks are today, next 6 to 12 months, 2 years and 5 years down the road. And of course, crisis management planning, right? If you think of business continuity as the way that the organization can recover its most critical business functions and processes during an incident or a crisis, crisis management speaks to how does the organization as a whole manage through that type of event. It's not function specific, but how does the entire organization get through that process or through that event, if you will. There's other elements here. And again, I think it's important to recognize that every company, every sector, every region is different. But if we just focus on those the highest response rates for these elements, I think we do find, again, that it's consistent with what we're hearing and what we're seeing. So we started off by talking about the concept of resiliency. I provided a kind of baseline practical framework for what this could look like organizationally within your business, that balanced approach. Then we spent the majority of our time going through some of the key findings, data points from our global resiliency study. If you're looking at all this information, you're looking at all these findings, and you're not sure what to do next, we find that the first thing you need to do is build a consensus around how your organization is structured. So in that practical model, that balanced approach, we focused on creating a more unified center and empowering the business. If that model speaks to you, if some variation of that model speaks to you, you need to go out and build a consensus around how your resources are supporting that vision, whatever that vision may be. This may seem intuitive, right? You may say, well, Ammi, of course, we have a vision and we need to go out and support it. But you'd be surprised how many leaders in this space simply are trying to operate today as they did yesterday. So building a consensus, making sure that every part of your organization, even your most junior staff members, understand the vision and the mission and are behind it. For example, if you're asking people to go across disciplines, right, to become deeper subject matter experts in more than one space, making sure that they are bought into that process, or at least that they recognize that this is what's happening and why it's happening, and that there will be training and awareness available to them to be successful in this model, can really go a long way. Working with executives, when you empower the business, spending the time with those business unit leaders, senior managers, investing the time in those conversations so they understand what you're trying to do and how they are a key part of that model. Perhaps most importantly, how you're giving them the tools to be successful can really go a long way in building and driving buy-in for your program. It's also important as you think about how you perhaps want to structure your organization, that you conduct a deep dive into the various resources you have. For example, mapping out the key capabilities against the resources you have, in leveraging that matrix concept to identify gaps and look to fill those gaps, right? It's not as simple as saying, well, we want this person to now do these 3 other things, but kind of speaking to understanding what that looks like specifically and where there are efficiencies and where there are gaps. Can also make sure that as you go through the change, whatever that change may look like, that you've mapped and identified what you have and what you need. Finally, the last bullet here, and this speaks to the first one as well, communicate the value and benefits of your new approach. If you're trying to do this differently, if you're looking at a new and creative way to think about your organization, or even just your team, making sure that you don't take for granted that even if your company, your organization has gone through a number of those crises or significant business interruptions that we've all seen over the past few years, don't assume that people understand the value. Constantly continue to communicate through training and awareness, internal communications, and other mechanisms, the value of what you're trying to do and how you're trying to do it. We recognize, control risk, that there's a lot of information here. We recognize that it can be challenging to kind of look for synergies and look for similarities across many different sectors all around the world. But if what we've said today resonates with you, if you're thinking about change, if you're thinking about what resiliency means for your organization, If you're not sure what resiliency means for your organization, or if you just want to have a chat and talk a little bit more about the information that I've talked through today, please feel free to reach out to me directly via my email on the screen, or if you'd like more information or if you'd like more information about this survey itself, please use the following link. That'll take you to our page where you can find a wealth of information. You can also be provided with the full comprehensive survey. I hope you found today's talk useful, and thank you very much for your time. Have a great day.
Thank you so much, Ammi, for delivering your session on the Global Resilience Survey. An incredibly informative session, and in some cases actually very surprising. And I just wanted to go through a couple questions with you. So to start, resilience is a theme that has become increasingly pertinent over recent years and is evident in the report, like you spoke about in your presentation, particularly with the rise of remote working, the pandemic, artificial intelligence and other technologies, etc. I suppose the list could go on. But given the ever-changing global risk environment, how do you envision the future trajectory of organizational resilience based on the insights from the survey?
Yeah, thank you, Rebecca. I think our expectation is that the trends that we're seeing today will only continue to grow, right? We don't see, historically, when we've done these surveys, it's kind of gone back and forth, and we've seen a real pendulum shift. We actually see more momentum for the same types of changes in the years to come, both in the short term and the long term. And more specifically, we see a deeper investment and recognition around the role that cybersecurity plays with traditional operational security, business continuity, and crisis management programs. We really see them kind of coming together in a way that we haven't in the past. We've seen small movements, but we really see a continued alignment across those various disciplines. I'd also offer that the idea around investing in training and awareness will only continue to grow as organizations really see and recognize the importance of these types of programs. Even if they're not willing to necessarily make the investments that they had historically, there is a growing recognition that everyone across the organization needs to be more engaged in these programs.
No, definitely. And I think you're right from my perspective. I think cyber is coming into fruition in terms of lots of different industry. Those lines that were very clear barriers previously are now being merged. You're seeing, cyber come in, like you said, into the, full bracket of security, but also into our personal lives, into our remote working, our hybrid logging onto public Wi-Fi's, all these kind of different aspects coming in that actually can expose extra vulnerabilities in a business that weren't otherwise there previously, or were very minimal risks. So it's definitely something that is opening up that market. And in terms of the survey itself, obviously you surveyed quite a few organizations, but I was interested to know if you found that in the survey results, obviously the measured resilience, did it differ depending on the industry or region?
Yeah, really good question. And the short answer is yes. I think one of the pronounced examples of that can be found in that connection to the ISO standard, right? I started off by making a joke about the definition of resiliency, but in all seriousness, there is a recognized standard around what that word means and what that means for your programs. We certainly found that there is a greater recognition around the importance of that definition in that standard in the European market versus perhaps in the United States, where it's a bit more broadly defined. I think there's also the idea of data privacy, data protection, and and the personal securities around that. With GDPR, as you would expect, there's a greater emphasis in the European market, again, around protecting that data. That's not to say that in other markets it's not as much of a concern, but there's certainly a greater emphasis around those needs. So there's certainly, the short answer is that we did find a difference. I think there's also just at a high level, the idea of kind of a crisis management and business continuity. I think organizations and parts of the world where there's a focus around reputation, you see a greater need for more robust internal communications and support and external communication strategies in support of those types of programs.
Perfect, thank you. And finally, you also spoke about proactive horizon scanning for threats and risks using technology. Do you think, in your opinion, that this is quite challenging to achieve for some businesses, especially when threats are constantly changing, or even because of the multiple different platforms of technologies to choose from? And I think particularly when you're looking at a difference between, a large corporate and their resources and budgets compared to maybe an SME.
I'm nodding my head furiously because the answer is yes, right? This is a tricky one. I think organizations that have historically invested in these types of platforms, even if it was more human intelligence, so instead of using technology, you're using actual analysts, whether they're geopolitical or security analysts. Right? I think it's been a more natural transition into leveraging the technology that's out there today. Businesses that haven't traditionally done that continue to struggle. These are not cheap investments that you need to make in your organization. And sometimes the counter to that is, well, we invest all of this time and money and resources, but then why can't I just open a publicly available news source to tell me what I should be concerned about? There is a counter to that, right? Because these platforms provide a very customizable view on what is specifically your top risk to your organization, but there is that pushback. We find that for those that are struggling, trying to figure out how they recognize individually that this may be important, but they're trying to figure out how they can sell the case, if you will. Through technology, there are much more affordable options out there. The trick is you need to be willing to sometimes look outside of your organization. It's not necessarily about bringing the resources in-house. It's about being able to leverage third-party, either technology platforms or human intelligence platforms, of which there are many, in a way that works for your organization. And again, this may sound intuitive, but start small. Understand what your top risks are. Look for a solution that can help you manage or at least scan for those risks. Start from there, get the small wins, and then grow once there's additional buy-in for your business, for what you're trying to do.
I suppose your first point of call and advice for business then is to predominantly conduct a risk assessment of your business as usual, and then go from there and see. Obviously, there's so many different areas that have risk when it comes to a business, but what are your priorities and what are your higher risks and what does that mean for the business? What's preventable and what's manageable and what is detrimental? All those different areas. Unfortunately, I would love to talk more, but we're running out of time rapidly. Yeah. But thank you so much, Ammi. I really appreciate you dedicating the time to talk to us today and present those findings of the survey. And thank you so much. If anybody would like to know more, please connect to Ammi on the platform and continue that conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it as well.